So welcome everyone officially to our workshop today, Information Literacy, Equity, and Social Justice. We are so excited to have you all here today. I know that a lot of folks know me, but for folks who do not, my name is Jane Hammonds. I am assistant professor in the University Libraries at Ohio State. I'm the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian, and you can contact me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. Please feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to talk more about these topics. And I'm super excited today to be joined by a co-presenter. So I'm going to go ahead and let her introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's so good to have you all here. My name is Jacqueline Sprates. I'm an information literacy librarian at Miami University. So some of the things that I do, I work with instructors on incorporating information literacy into their classes. I also host an online learning object repository that collects library instructors' learning materials. And I work with students on, incorporating information literacy skills that they can use academically and in their everyday lives. So I'm so excited to be part of this workshop, and thank you so much for all of you being here today. So we can go ahead and get started on looking at those workshop outcomes. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. We are going to explore definitions of social justice, equity, and information literacy, as well as reflect on those definitions. We're also going to be looking at the intersections that exist among these ideas, and Jane and I will share activities and resources that you can use to connect these ideas in your teaching as well. So we have a couple of polls for you to get us started. The first one is, how would you rate your familiarity with the concept of social justice? And then the second question for you is, how would you rate your familiarity with the concept of information literacy? So you should see those polls coming up, and we'll give you a couple of moments to respond to those. And okay, and then also, Lorian, you write in the chat to have a link to the learning object repository. Yes, absolutely. I would be happy to add that into that handout. And I can also just get a quick link right now.
And so we'll give it just 10 more seconds to let folks respond. And then we'll go ahead and share those responses. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, participation, we do have some interactive elements. As you see here, participation is encouraged, but we completely understand for those folks, if you're eating lunch or you just feel that you need, want to take a step back and just listen, that is completely understandable as well. So, please engage to the level of your own comfort. All right, so hopefully folks should be seeing those poll results. So as we're looking here, you can see we have a lot of folks that are very familiar with the concept of social justice, but we do have some folks that are not really as familiar with that concept.
Yeah, I don't think we're able to see those results.
Not seeing them?
Oh, no, they're popping up now.
Okay, at least sorry about that. So I'll let everyone have a chance to take a look real quickly. And then a little bit less familiarity with information literacy, a few more folks that are a little bit more unfamiliar with that concept, which is great. That's why we're here today. So thank you all for participating in that poll. Okay, so hopefully folks. So we'll go ahead then and jump into thinking about how we define some of these key terms. So I know, as we just saw with the poll, that some of you will be familiar with some of these definitions, but we think it's really important to kind of start us all off on a fairly equal footing with some shared ideas about what these terms mean that we're going to be talking about. So we did have another interactive component where we wanted to give you a chance to think about your understanding of the concept of social justice and think about what a socially just society would look like to you. So I will share in the chat again. We're going to do this as a Jamboard activity. So I put in the chat just now, hopefully that did not go out to everyone, sorry. But that one more time, so that actually does go out to everyone this time around. So you should see the link to that Jamboard there. And so we'll go out and give you a chance to think about what would a socially just society look like to you. So let me see if I can get out of this presentation, go ahead and go out to that Jamboard. Hopefully folks are seeing the Jamboard. If you are not, please do let me know. If you haven't added a response to a Jamboard before, I think the easiest way to do that is to go over here on the left-hand side, add a sticky note, and that will allow you to add your response there as a sticky note and go ahead and post that. So we'll let everyone have a chance to respond, thinking about what a socially just society would look like to you. Right. And Jacqueline, you are seeing the live? Okay.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Cool. So feel free to go ahead and continue adding your responses, but just taking a look at some of these responses, some of the themes that I'm seeing, some responses around the idea of equal opportunities and resources, right? So that all voices are equally important. Yeah. So definitely some responses around there, health insurance for everyone, a complete reimagining of society that ameliorates all structural inequalities. Yeah, so thinking about, what are those inequalities that we know exist and what are those things that we could do to, overcome those. And someone had mentioned reparations, as a related idea there. Restorative justice, we also see that idea. Economic mobility, same laws apply to all. Mercy over judgment. Yeah, really like that one. All voices equally important. Equitable opportunities and fairness for all people in all areas, including education, wellness, and the justice system. Yes, a world where resources are equitably distributed with no inequities across safety, security, housing, food. Everyone having equitable access to resources and power, all voices being heard in decision making. Yeah, so you can see definitely, right, a lot of similarity as we look at these responses about equal access or equitable access to resources, to the same justice system, to housing and security, right? People being able to make their voices heard, recognizing that everyone has the ability to share, their voice, how people are judged, the resources that people have available to them, right? Peace, health, and wellness for all, right? So a safe, secure society where people have accesses to the resources that they need, where people have the ability to share and participate, right? And to have and make their voices known, right? Yeah, so great. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your responses there. So we'll go ahead and go back to our presentations, equity over equality, right? Wealth accommodation, yes, absolutely. Fair housing, yeah, so many areas where this really applies. Basically, the entire, think about society as a whole, yes. All right, so we'll go ahead and go back to our presentation here. Hopefully folks are now seeing seeing the slideshow again. If ever you're not seeing what I am saying that you're seeing, please do let me know. So just wanted to share a few definitions, and I think, folks got these definitions from the responses, but just wanted to highlight the importance of equity. There was a lot of responses in there that talked about equality, And I think it's important to really think about equity and what the difference is in terms of equity and equality. And we think, equality as being really important. But when we think about social justice, is it important that everyone is treated the same? Or is it important that it's recognized that there are differences and that there have been, structural, historic inequalities that have meant that some people are starting at a different position than other people. And so, thinking about that difference, that, equality is treating everyone the same. Equity is thinking about recognizing what those inequalities are and thinking about how we can make changes that will ensure that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Right. So I wanted to just share that definition of equity because that concept of equity is so important when we think about social justice. So fair and just practices that ensure that all can thrive. So not exactly treating everyone the same way, but acknowledging and addressing the inequalities that actually do exist. All right, so a few definitions of social justice just to highlight and share. I really like this, that social justice is both a goal and a process. So as folks mentioned in their responses, participation of people from all groups, full and equitable participation of people in all the groups. So the ability for people to engage in their own lives, to make their voices heard, to be a part of the process, right? And then that we will achieve that by a democratic and participatory process that respects all who are involved, right? And gives everyone agency to have some say over their own life. So another definition from the same resource, social justice world, one that is equitable, ecologically sustainable. I really liked having that part in there. And talks about, thinking about wellness and safety and security, physical and psychological safety and security for all people, fair distribution of resources, respect, inclusion, again, the ability for people to engage and participate and make, contribute to the decisions that are being made that affect their lives. And I think a few people got to this. There was the comment in there about, reparations or restorative justice. Someone mentioned that as well. So it's not just thinking about, what we want this society to look like, but thinking about that this also involves the need to eliminate the injustices that we see. So how we can build this society, and that requires us to recognize the injustices that exist already and take active steps to eliminate that injustice. So I really liked those definitions. I thought that those were really great ways to think about social justice. Wanted to pause here to see if there are any aspects of those definitions that really resonated really strongly with you. Anything that you thought was really important to highlight. If there are anything that is missing from those definitions that you would like to see added, you can add those in there as well. And then if you have just in general any questions around the definition of social justice. So you can feel free to share your responses in chat if you have questions, comments, thoughts around those definitions. If you want to see those definitions again, they are all on the handout that I shared. So if you go to that participant handout in the link there in the chat, all of those definitions are there as well. So we'll give everyone just a few seconds to reflect, think about those definitions, and share any comments that you might have. And Emily shared, I agree with you. I loved ecologically sustainable. Yes. Krista shared the difference between equal and equitable. Yeah, I think that's such an important difference to recognize. I don't want to say that equality is a bad thing in any way, but if we don't recognize that some people are starting with a lot more than others, if we give everyone the same opportunity, but some folks have started so much further back, that's not really going to create a socially just society. Yes, fair is not always equal. Absolutely. Rocky shared, I like mutually shaped. Yes, that everyone needs to have that ability to participate in those discussions and in those processes that are determining, the way that we live our lives. Great. Yeah, wonderful, Krista. Absolutely. So continue to feel free to share any comments that you have in there around these issues, and then we're going to move forward a little bit and talk about information literacy as a concept, and then we'll be bringing these all of these definitions and terms together. So I'll go ahead and pass it over, and I'll let Jacqueline talk about information literacy.
Sure. Yeah. So in this section, we're going to talk about some definitions of information literacy and give kind of context of how it's kind of evolved. So to get us started on this section, go back to that Jamboard and write in, if you'd like, how do you define or understand information literacy? So we'll give you a couple of minutes to start putting in your responses for that. And of course, it's all, you know, if you choose to participate, we'd love to see some of your responses here.
And you can use the little arrow up here at the top to, to move to the next slide, so you can put your definition there.
All right, so they're starting to come in now here. That's great. Let's see. So I see critical thinking, definitely. Thinking critically about the source of information, understanding how to evaluate the information you consume. Yeah, definitely that's an important piece. We don't want to just kind of be on autopilot when we consume information, but be thinking about, you know, having a deal of skepticism when we look at things. Let's see here. Being able to find relevant information and put it into context so you can use it effectively. I feel like that is a very important skill to have. And it's definitely something that takes practice for sure. Someone writes ability to find, process, and evaluate information. Yes, definitely. There's a lot of different processes that go into being information literate. The ability to evaluate and ethically use information. Yes. Someone else writes, knowing how to evaluate the credibility of a source and then being able to interpret the source from a critical perspective. I think that's so important. These are all wonderful. Recognizing information needs, knowing where to look, using information ethically, evaluating and thinking critically about information, understanding how information is created. Those are all such important pieces to this. Not just, you know, being able to get to information, but also knowing, you know, what's going on in the background. This is great.
Are we ready to go back to the...
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing those. Okay, so to give a little bit of background of information literacy, the Presidential Committee on Information Literacy was one of the earlier conceptions of this idea. In this report, they discussed the emergence of the information age, which is really a way of thinking about information is growing at a rapid rate, and how do we deal with that? So their solution to dealing with that is information literacy. They even call it a survival skill. And they describe someone as information literate, as you can see here, a person who is able to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information, which I was seeing those responses similar to that in the Jamboard, so that's great. So they also sorry, I just not quite done. They also discuss this imbalance of who is able to access quality information and who is disadvantaged in this area. And they talk about, you know, the need for if we're able to be information literate, we should have access to quality information first, and the importance of that. So earlier, in these conversations of information literacy, we're already seeing connections to this with social justice. And next slide. So, as teaching information literacy has evolved, a framework for information literacy for higher education was developed. And in this framework, it includes threshold concepts that are interconnected and provide a holistic view of information literacy. It really encourages students to think critically about the information that they engage with. So next slide. So the frames, which Jane will go more into detail on, have these kind of basic pieces. So they have conceptual understandings, habits of mind, and skills or practices. So some, example of a conceptual understanding could be, that a learner recognizes how and why information has value or what makes a source authoritative. Habits of mind or dispositions might include, helping learners understand that research is not always a straight path, but to have persistence and flexibility as they continue searching. Maybe also even, having conflicting perspectives on resources and knowing how to make sense of that. Some skills or practices could include, how to effectively use a database, how to read a scholarly article, or how to find a source that is authoritative. And critical information literacy really goes a step further than the frames in their discussions of social justice. They also critique the framework for not going far enough to explicitly discuss social justice. And one of the aims of critical information literacy is to look at the systems of power that influence information production, dissemination, access, and consumption. And a big goal of this is to really encourage learners to challenge those power structures and really engage with those ideas to see kind of what's going on in the background. And also, I thought something that was really interesting about critical information literacy as well is, that information literacy is a human right. So in our discussion, what are some connections that you're starting to see between equity, social justice, and information literacy? What questions do you have at this point before we kind of really dig more into this?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you define the difference between information literacy and media literacy.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there are a lot of overlaps between these two things. And I think, literacies, there are a lot of literacies out there that we can teach. I mean, there's even news literacy specifically. I think that they're very similar. They engage with information. I think information literacy is often attributed by librarians. And so we have the framework that was developed to specifically talk about information literacy, but there are a lot of overlaps with media literacy. But I think that's a great question, Carolyn. I think that at least, in my work, I've been able to publish in media literacy journals, and, looking to publish in information literacy journals. So I think that there is a lot of overlap. There's just maybe different audiences sometimes who work on these different literacies. And then Dawn writes, it was obvious everyone was not literate information or media with health during the pandemic. Okay, so we're seeing some information literacy needs there for sure. Yeah, thank you so much for writing your responses there. So now we'll go back to Jane.
And we'll try to, in this part, try to draw out a little bit more specifically some of the connections. And I think Jacqueline already started to highlight some of these, but if you think back to that first definition of information literacy, that was find, evaluate, and use information. You may not strongly see a social justice component in there, but as you start thinking about it, I think that there are a lot of connections. So a few things that we wanted to highlight. So, first of all, I think, at the most basic level, right, you have to have access to information, right? And we know that not everyone has the same access to information. You can't be information literate unless you have access to that information. And so much depends on our ability to have access to information. And for various reasons, not everyone has the same access, whether it's the fact that someone can't afford broadband internet access, or that someone lives in a country that has very strict censorship laws. So not everyone is going to have the same ability to access information. And, it could be, maybe you live in a library desert and you don't have a library that's anywhere close to your home. There's so many different forms that this could take, that someone could be in a position where they don't have access to the information that they need that would allow them to fully engage in society. So Laura Saunders, who wrote this article on information literacy and social justice, she highlights, different forms of access that this might take. So, actually, not being able to put your hands on a book or not being able to access an article, but also, that people have different social networks and different types of social capital. And some people have broader networks that, connect them to information in ways that other people that are more isolated in their networks do not have. I'm a librarian. If I need information about something, I have a wide group of people that I can reach out to get information on that. But other people might not be connected into those same kinds of networks and have the same ability to take advantage of that situation. And then, of course, there's the cognitive and intellectual access, and that gets into the, having the ability to actually be able to, as folks were talking about, to critically evaluate and think about information. Not everyone, for a variety of reasons, is going to have the education, that have the background that is going to allow them to engage with information in certain ways. Thinking about the lack of school librarians that a lot of students face. Students may be coming in and never having had experiences, engaging with librarians, using databases, using those types of resources. So there's all different types of access that is involved when we think about that. And then, so as you already heard, so the framework for information literacy highlights these core concepts that are really relevant to students or everyone being able to effectively engage with information. So we don't have time to go a lot into the background of the framework, but there are 3 concepts that we really wanted to highlight and think about the social justice or equity aspects related to those concepts. So as you already heard, one of the concepts is this idea that it's important for students to have an understanding of information having value and all of the different ways that information does have value, who it's valuable to, what it's valuable for, and an understanding that because information has valuable, because you can often really think about information as a commodity, there are a lot of rules and restrictions and guidelines around how information can be accessed and how it can be shared. And because of those rules and restrictions and guidelines, as we already mentioned, not everyone is going to have the same access to information. Some individuals, some groups are going to be marginalized within those systems that produce and disseminate and share information. Not everyone is going to have the same ability to access information. Not everyone is going to have the same ability to make their voice heard. And, because of that differing access, right, that creates issues for those people that they're not able to fully engage in society. This concept also really highlights this idea that, there, as we mentioned, lots of rules and restrictions and guidelines around information and how that can be shared. Copyright law as an example. And, this ability to think about, is copyright law equitable? Is it fair? Are there situations which the better response is actually to not follow copyright law, right? We know that corporations have had a big impact on copyright law, of course. And so, having the ability to make informed choices about whether or not you're going to comply with those sort of current legal and socioeconomic guidelines around information. Authority is constructed and contextual. This is a really complex one, but just thinking, that there are certain types of information, certain types of sources that is considered to be more authoritative than others. And we want students to be able to recognize and find, authoritative information, but we also have to recognize that within those systems, that is going to mean that certain voices are not going to be considered as authoritative. And thinking about the systems that give someone authority and don't, give someone authority. The peer review process, for example, we know that only certain, people are going to be able to submit and publish articles through the peer review process, and those that can't, are not going to be considered as authoritative as others. Is that really a fair system? And then the last one to highlight, this idea of scholarship as conversation. So knowing that scholars are consistently engaging and talking with each other through their work. But as we mentioned, there are barriers. Not everyone can enter and to engage into those conversations. If you don't have the right background, if you don't have the right education, if you don't have the right credentials, your ability to participate in those scholarly conversations can be limited. And as a result, we also know that there are cases where there's been research done on certain groups of people. The voices of the people that are being researched, they are missing from the conversation, right? So it's about, people from a more privileged background talking about another group of people without actually listening to those people, because those people don't have the ability to engage in that scholarly conversation. So those are some of the areas that we really wanted to just highlight, a lot of these connections between information literacy, so it's about having access to information, but it's more than that. It's about having the ability to create information, having the ability to share information, having the ability to engage in scholarly conversations, but just general conversations as well. The political conversations that are going on, economic conversations that are going on, being able to engage in those conversations, thinking about who gets cited and who doesn't. What is considered an authoritative source and what is not considered an authoritative source, and what are the inequities involved in determining what those types of sources are. And then just generally, how are people represented when they're being talked about in the media, in scholarly publications? Are those representations, fair? So lots of different connections that we wanted to highlight there. So we wanted to give you a chance again. I see some responses in the chat to think again about other connections that you might see between information literacy and social justice, and any of your thoughts that you might have on any of the ones that we have highlighted, or any questions that you might have. So Rocky shared, a great example, illegal aliens mess. Biased terms can prevent engagement with sources. So thinking about like how sources are cataloged, and the term illegal alien being used, and what does that say about the mindset of the folks that are searching, and the challenge of trying to change that term, and it became a big mess for everyone. So what is our system of cataloging and sorting information? What does that say about different groups of people? Tanya shared, yes, and where to find information that is trustworthy and non-exploitative of the vulnerable. Yes, absolutely. Great point. Nicole shared, this is something I've always been thinking about in my work with the Ohio Prison Education Exchange Project. Our incarcerated students crave information literacy, but lack access to so many of the necessary resources. Yes, and there's such a movement now to like ban books in prisons, and how wrong that is. The right to read, the right to access to information for the incarcerated. Absolutely. I have a question. What is your thought on information that is biased versus information that is derived from different interpretations, perspectives, value systems? That's a really, really great question. And when you think about bias, necessarily is often presented as something that is bad, but really everything has bias, because everything is written by someone with a different perspective, right? And so I think that there has to be that balance between opening up to those different interpretations and perspectives, but it creates that issue of challenge is if those perspectives are providing information that is factually wrong, then it becomes a much more kind of tricky situation. So that's a really interesting question and a really interesting topic to think about. Access to internet technology, someone had mentioned there. Dawn shared 54% of Americans read at the 6th grade reading level or below. Yeah, which is so disheartening. Access to internet technology impacts information equity, particularly in rural regions. Yes, absolutely. Not everyone has that same access. Book banning. Yep. Public health, we try to disseminate information that the larger population can comprehend. And that's really important when we think about how we shape our messages. Sharing things in a way that that the general population can comprehend. Rocky, shared bias is sort of, my perspective is right and yours is wrong and bad. Yeah. So I think, yeah, we definitely want to think about how we can be open to multiple perspectives without, that gets into the issue of objectivity. Is objectivity really possible? Is objectivity, really good? Yeah, those are such great comments and questions. So thank you all so much. We'll go ahead and pass it over and share information really quickly on a proposed information literacy concept.
Yeah, so kind of going back to those criticisms of the framework, a lot of criticisms revolved around, social justice shouldn't just be kind of weaved into the existing framework, but it should be a new frame completely on its own that talks about information and social justice. So this is a draft of a proposed frame that Laura Saunders put together that explicitly talks about social justice. So this is what she has proposed. Information is created within existing power structures, and those power structures can impact the production and dissemination of information, but they can also distort, suppress, or misrepresent information. We also want learners to understand and use information most effectively so that they can examine and interrogate the power structures that impact that information, and also analyze the ways that information can be used both to inform as well as misinform. Some of the related practices that she has proposed for this frame, you can see here in this list. So, the first one, looking at and analyzing each stage of the information process and the power structures that are behind those different stages. Identify how the commodification of information can impact access and availability. Also, recognize when information is missing or incomplete or inaccessible, and how, that could be an indicator of power dynamics or bias. Also looking at ways that information can be used to persuade, as well as misinform or coerce. So these are just some of the parts of the draft she put together, but she also points out, that this is kind of really to spark discussion and be thinking about, how can we build this frame to really get at these ideas of how to incorporate social justice into our teaching of information literacy. So this is another chance to share your thoughts. So what are your thoughts on this proposed information literacy concept? How are you thinking about this, and what questions do you have about it at this point? Love to kind of see some of your responses here. And it's great that you guys are talking in the chat. That's wonderful. That's interesting, Rocky. So yeah, we'll have to think about it more, wary of siloing social justice into its own frame. I think that's a really good point in thinking about this. And Jennifer writes, it's such an important initiative. How can we become involved? That's interesting too. This is something that she wrote in an article that was published pretty closely after the frames were developed. Jane, do you have like an idea of like what are the next steps for this frame?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. The framework, when it was developed, was intended to be a living document. But I don't know if there is a strategy in place for thinking about when and how it's going to be updated. But one of the things I could recommend would be something like, as you think about this concept, if you develop activities or resources around this concept, there's the tool that's the sandbox for the framework for information literacy that has folks that have shared and developed activities around this. So I would recommend thinking about adding activities that you've developed to that, if that would be something that would be appropriate to you in your role. But that is a really great question. And that's something that I would like to look into in terms of thinking about if a process is planned to be in place for updating the framework. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Rocky, you point out you would like to see more knowledge practices and dispositions added to each frame that more explicitly address social justice. Yes, I think that's definitely like one of the main critiques of the framework, is that they don't do enough to really talk about like specific problems and how to kind of address those in our teaching. So yes, definitely. Okay, great.
Yeah, the word social justice is not mentioned specifically anywhere in the framework. So for this last part, we wanted to share a few ideas for some teaching activities and resources. And as we were talking about this when we were putting the workshop together, there are so many different directions that you could take with this topic. Because social justice and equity really does infuse so many different aspects of information literacy. So we're going to share just a few examples of different kinds of activities that we think are related, but there are many other examples, and we have a folder. I'll share that folder again of some additional teaching activities. That's that last teaching activity folder with some additional ones that we don't have time to talk about today. And then if you have ideas for activities and resources around teaching, helping students to engage with this concept, we'd love to hear those as well. So just a few that we wanted to mention. So we're going to start this section with a very quick little pop quiz. Which of the following topics do you think is likely to have the most coverage on Wikipedia? A, female poets from Africa, B, American college football, or C, Native American scientists. Right, and so we see some responses coming in, and we see a lot of people who are saying B, right? And yes, right? So when we think about Wikipedia as an information tool and a resource that many of our students are familiar with, Wikipedia tends to be written by men, and it tends to be written by men from the United States or from Western Europe. And so you're likely to see a lot more articles about American college football than you are about Native American scientists. And so just to show as an example, I went up and looked. They have 23 pages devoted to Native American scientists and 163 pages devoted just to Ohio State football coaches. And so basically every coach at Ohio State, every assistant coach, has had their own Wikipedia page. And so I think that this is a great example of the type of activity that you can do with students using a resource and a tool that they're already really familiar with to get them to start thinking about these issues of social justice and equity when it comes to information. There's been some great articles written about Wikipedia as being the biases in Wikipedia that you can see, gender biases and just general bias in terms of what get covered and what does not get covered, who has articles published about them, who does not. And this could be a great way to get students really thinking about who is being represented, who is not. And a student gave a presentation years ago, but basically if you don't have a Wikipedia page, what does that say about your value? If you're a scientist and you don't have a Wikipedia page, does that say something about how valuable you're considered? Talking about, a woman who won a major award in science, and then they were, startled to find that she didn't actually have a page and had to put one together really quickly, right? So, have students compare different categories of representation of the topics that you're going to find and the topics that you won't find on Wikipedia. And so, this is, I think, a fairly simple activity that you could do in a lot of different contexts. You could, if you're in a discipline, you could focus on articles within your discipline and have them talk about what pages are there, what pages are not. Who are the important, scholars or scientists or researchers in your field that do have pages and that don't have pages, and getting them to think about this issue of who is represented and who is not. And so I think that this is a really great activities at a sort of more basic level to get students into thinking about this topic. Another sort of related activity that you could do is related to inclusive citation practices. I gave a workshop on this a couple of weeks ago that some folks might have been able to attend, but this is just one example of an activity that you could do where you have students give them an article and have students think about, for example, the gender dynamics of that article. You know, how many of the sources that being cited were written by women? How many were written by men? Or you can, you know, there are other ways that you could think about this and then again, raise those questions. If, you know, 95% of these citations are to men, whose voices are you missing? And what, you know, what that might contribute to that scholarship. So there's a couple great resources there, one by Mahabali, which is really great about inclusive citations, how diverse are your references. So again, a great way to get students thinking about some of these issues that may not immediately come to mind as they are thinking about their own citation practices.
So another activity is the simulated information inequality. So in this activity, students are given an assignment, but also have a limited number of resources that they have to be able to complete that assignment. So following that, students have a discussion about the limitations of the resources they had and how that may have kept them from being able to completely, you know, satisfactorily complete that assignment, or given them different information than they would have been able to come up with if they had a full grasp of all the information that could have been available to them, and really starts a conversation on information privilege. And then the next activity is analyzing representation in the news. So in this activity, I worked with students to look at disability issues covered in the news and the differences that may come from someone who is not a disabled journalist writing about a disability issue and someone who is a disabled journalist writing about that issue. And what they do is compare a couple of articles where they look at different perspectives, and think about, you know, how if they're looking at a perspective from a disabled journalist, if they are getting a fuller picture or a more realistic one of an issue that is coming about. And also just getting them to reflect on, you know, how they will look at perspectives of those who are most affected by an event and how important it is for those voices not to be left out of how we make sense of what is going on. And also getting students to think about, you know, how will they look for those voices in the future as they, you know, look at what's going on in the current events.
And so we have, as we mentioned, you know, we don't have time to cover every type of assignment that could get students thinking about this, but we do have some additional assignments that you all could take a look at if you're interested, and they're available in that teaching activities folder. So feel free to take a look at any of those. We have one, for example, on the peer review process and thinking about that in terms of equity and justice. Where students think about their own publications options, and if they wanted to publish in open access, what would that mean? What would that not mean? So there's a lot of different types of activities that you could do. So many different angles that you could take. But I think, you know, the key thing was thinking about how can we get our students thinking critically about these issues of access and representation and inclusion in the information that they are using, in their own ability to create information. Share information. Yeah, so all right, so we've got actually managed to finish with like 5 minutes left, which makes me really happy. So we have some time for questions, comments, thoughts that folks have. If you're interested in sharing, we have a few options. The most important thing that you learned, or if you have an action step that you would like to take, if you have a question or a challenge, or something that you're anxious or concerned about, or, you know, just general comments that you would like to share. We do have references, so I'll just, you know, make sure that those will be shared. Everyone will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording, the slides, and the folder. So all of that information will be available. And so we'll go ahead and open it up now to questions, comments, thoughts that folks have. Thank you, Caroline. Tanya shared, I didn't think much about citation inequities. And actually, as I mentioned, I did a workshop on that recently on, you know, citation inequality, research metrics bias, really fascinating topic. And I am happy to share those resources with folks if they're interested in seeing those. Let's see some other comments that have come in. Jennifer, I definitely will be checking out the teaching resources to try in my grades 6 through 8 humanities classes. Wonderful. Yes, thank you. Yes, Tanya, absolutely. I'll just put that link to that recording in the follow-up email as well. So you all have both of those. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, thank you all. Rocky shared simulation inequality exercise reminds a lot of the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise, how to mitigate the frustration, emotional response to such an activity. That's a really interesting question, Rocky. And I think that would come into in terms of the transparency that you have with the students. You know, that you were deliberately limited and this is the reason why. That this is the goal was of this assignment was to create that, you know, that sense of frustration, to, you know, have students develop an understanding of what it might feel like to be in that situation where you don't have the same access to information as others. So I think as long as you're transparent with students about that, that is the purpose of that assignment and that it's completely understandable if they feel that frustration, you know, I think that hopefully would help to mitigate some of that. Right. So yeah, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Pat. Let's see. Like the concept of serendipity. Do you have any thoughts on that? Conversation seems to be a good way of finding it. Like you said, yeah. So I'm not sure, Emily, exactly what you mean in terms of serendipity. If you wanted to share a little bit more, if you're still here, if not, that's okay. Nicholas shared, I want to incorporate more diverse scientists in my lecture, but the examples are hard to find. Wonder if this is something ChatGPT would be able to help with validation, of course. Yeah, that would definitely be a little bit tricky just because ChatGPT has a habit of making up citations. And so it's can't often find, well, maybe difficult to find ones that are actually real citations. But Nicholas, I do have a list and it's on the worksheet of some resources where you can go to find more diverse voices. There's a site about like 500 scientists. There's one that 500 queer scientists. There's another one. So there's some resources that are out there for folks that if you are looking to find more diverse voices to include, those should be on the handout. But I'll make sure, if not, to share those with everyone, because thankfully folks have been collecting some of that information to provide those resources. Nicole, let's see, training new faculty to teach Ohio prisons this May. I'll definitely be looking for all these resources and incorporating them into our training. Wonderful. Yes, absolutely, Nicole. That would be great. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks, Nick. All right, so we are right at 1 o'clock. So I am definitely happy to stick around for a few more minutes to see if folks have any additional questions or comments. But thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, look for that follow-up email.
Yes, thank you, everyone.